Correlation is not causation. When is this a valid argument, and when is it just intellectually lazy? Correlation is not causation can be a valid argument, but in fact, it's usually used in arguments for intellectually lazy people to reject evidence on point. If you're having a discussion or an argument and you provide evidence, then by definition, you've already made a connection that these are not just correlated, that there's a causal relationship. The lazy response that correlation is not causation is not a logically valid argument. You have to show why this is not causal. In fact, they're probably arguing the exact opposite effect, and therefore admitting causation. This makes no sense at all. This is like the arguments, you're not open-minded, you're a denier, you're being selfish, scientific consensus. An example of this that I've seen very recently is people arguing with climate catastrophists, and they point out that, in fact, the temperature rises before the CO2 rises. The climate catastrophists will counter, correlation is not causation, but they're trying to make the argument that correlation is causation, that the CO2 going up was the cause of the temperature rise. In fact, people who understand science understand that CO2 follows rather than leads temperature. The reason this happens is because as the temperature of the water increases in the ocean, it releases CO2. So they're providing an explanation. That is that the solubility of CO2 is less at higher temperatures. So therefore, the temperature leads the increase in CO2 and is the exact reason why this phenomenon occurs. Some classic examples where this is a valid argument will help you understand this point better. There was a scientific study that showed almost perfect correlation between ice cream sales and shark attacks in the United States, suggesting that there's a causal reason between ice cream sales and shark attacks will require further explanation. In fact, the easy explanation, the one that is straightforward, is that both happen when the temperature is higher in the United States. The next example is that the number of master's degrees and the amount of box office sales for movies are highly correlated. Does this mean that there's a causal effect? Well, I can't think of an obvious causal connection, but the most likely explanation is that both of them relate to an increase in the global population over time. Another example is that the number of pool drownings is highly correlated with nuclear energy production. But the only way this would suggest a causal relationship is if the number of pool drownings occurred close to nuclear power plants. Another example is measles cases versus the marriage rate. Both have been declining, but no one has a plausible explanation why these two are causally connected. The last example is high school graduates versus pizza consumption. Both of them were going up over time. There's no obvious connection between the two. Nutrition studies, which are huge survey studies, are notorious for trying to make correlations into causation. These studies have numerous flaws. They look for very minor correlations to push an agenda, which is invalid epistemologically. This is not a new idea, that you have to look at correlations more carefully. This comes straight from Bacon's understanding of induction. Many people act like this is just an outgrowth of our understanding of modern statistics. No, Sir Francis Bacon understood this back in the 1600s. So you're not brilliant when you argue correlation is not causation. You have to provide additional information in order to make a logically valid argument. An example I personally experienced recently of this correlation is not causation happened when I pointed out that the USA was the technological leader of the modern world. The USA had the highest standard of living in the 19th and 20th centuries, and it had the strongest property rights for inventors in the 19th and 20th century. These points mirror the exact Austrian arguments and libertarian arguments against patents. They argue patents slow down the process by which new technologies are developed, that they inhibit the diffusion of technologies, and they inhibit the economy. So, I was clearly responding to the causal relationship suggested by the libertarians and the Austrians. But the response I got was the lazy argument correlation is not causation, which is absurd in this case. I'm responding to their causal argument, and the evidence is overwhelming. Using Bacon as our guide, we can look at the cases where there's no technological or economic progress, in which there's less technological diffusion and slower economic growth. In all those cases, what you'll find is that there was a very weak or non-existent patent system. It's obvious that property rights for inventions are going to encourage people to create more inventions. This was exactly what Jacob Smukler, the economist, found in his book Inventions and Economic Growth. The argument correlation is not causation is usually used by intellectually lazy people who do not want to respond to the obvious evidence from the real world. It's an easy way to dismiss this. Usually then they go on to present their own evidence, so it's clearly fraud. Any attack on reason is an attack on freedom. Long live freedom, damn it.